All right, we will go ahead and begin. First off, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in this important conversation. I am Dr. Ken Moffitt, and I serve as a professor of political science here at SIUE and also as the department's chair. To start things off before the conversation begins, there's a couple of housekeeping items to which I should attend. And for those who've been to a few Zoom webinars, you've probably heard some of these. First off, please put all questions in the Q&A, and we'll endeavor to get to as many questions as we can. And you can upvote questions if there's one or more in which you're particularly interested, and I, as moderator, will go ahead and monitor the Q&A. Secondly, if there's other matters to which you'd like me to attend apart from the Q&A, please reach out to me, and I will handle what's needed as needed. So the purpose of today's panel is to follow up on a political science panel on February 4th, in which we talked about the events in Ukraine and Russia's aggression. Now, as we know, a lot's happened since February 4th, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the destruction of Ukrainian cities, mass loss of life, and a humanitarian crisis that has many dimensions to it, and much more. In today's panel, we'll talk about all these things to increase our community's understanding of the events in Ukraine. With that, I introduce each of our distinguished panelists and thank them for lending their expertise to our university community. Dr. Suranjan Baratni is an associate professor of political science. His research focuses broadly on issues of international security. He is especially interested in studying different forms of political violence, such as terrorism and ethnic and racial violence. And his research has been published in a number of different outlets. Dr. Olga Bezanova is from Kharkiv, Ukraine. She's a professor of Spanish literature and chair of the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at SIUE. She's published 3 award-winning books and over 30 academic articles on contemporary Hispanic literature. In 2019, Dr. Bezanova was awarded the Panteleimon Kulish Medal by the Literature, Art, and Communications Academy of Ukraine for a significant contribution to the promotion of Ukrainian literature in the United States and Hispanic countries. Dr. Sorin Nastasia is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Communication Studies, for which he also serves as the graduate program director and is the director of the International Studies program here at SIUE. He is from Romania in Eastern Europe, where he earned master's degrees in American Cultural Studies, International Relations, and Public Relations, and worked as a counselor for the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education prior to arriving to the US to pursue a PhD in Communication and Public Discourse at the University of North Dakota. At SIUE, he pursues graduate and undergraduate courses in public relations and strategic communications. His research focuses on comparing public relations practices worldwide, assessing crisis communication responses, and examining media portrayals of underprivileged groups. Former Congressman John Shimkus served in the US House as a representative from Collinsville in the 15th District from 1997 to 2021. During his time in Congress, he founded the House Baltic Caucus alongside then Representative Dennis Kucinich. He was also significantly involved with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization during his time in Congress, representing the United States in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So welcome to each one of our panelists, and we look forward to hearing from you. So to begin the conversation, I direct the initial question to Dr. Bezanova, and that is this. Can you tell us a bit about what's happened in and around Ukraine to get to this point since the last panel discussion on events in Ukraine since February 4th?
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you for my co-panelists. I'm going to share some slides with you. I have to resume a very long history in just a few minutes, and I'll try to do this best as I can. In 1991, Ukraine achieved its long-awaited independence and national sovereignty. But from the beginning and based on historic precedent of centuries, Ukrainians feared the possibility of Russia's aggression. Budapest agreements were signed in 1994, where Russia recognized Ukrainian sovereignty and guaranteed its territorial integrity. Not a decade passed, however, when Russia undertook its first effort to breach Ukrainian territory and annex a small part of its land. And this was how things would develop since then. Russia would take a step, see how it's received, retract, regroup, and take a bigger step, and so on. So what happened? In 2003, And please notice that this is 2003, so before the famous eastward expansion of the NATO in 2004. At that time, the Ukrainian president was on a state visit in Latin America, and Russia used this opportunity of the Ukrainian leader being far away and started building a dirt road to a tiny Ukrainian island of Tuzla. The significance of that island is that it lies right here between mainland Russia and the Crimea. So obviously, the moment you build the land road to it, it becomes easier to claim Tuzla as part of sovereign Russian territory and then continue the aggression towards the Crimea. And this is today's war in miniature. This is the very first embryonic post-Soviet attempt by Russia to aggress against Ukraine. This is also the Tuzla Island seen from a different kind of perspective. At that time in 2003, the Ukrainian president came back immediately from the state visit, and he pushed back very strongly against the Russian expansion toward Tuzla. It was not until 2015 when Russia actually managed to build its famous dirt road towards Tuzla, and in 2018, the Tuzla Island was finally annexed by Russia. But the seeds had been planted 15 years before that. In 2013, the people of Ukraine were already very tired, especially the younger generations, from living in this post-Soviet country that still hadn't shed the legacy of totalitarianism, that had all of the institutions and practices that had been inherited from the USSR. And there was this massive popular uprising that now we know in Ukraine under the name of the Revolution of Dignity, where millions of Ukrainians took to the streets to overthrow the corrupt government of Yanukovych and start building a real democracy in Ukraine. And you can imagine how these images of people rising up and trying to build democracy must have looked from Russia with its authoritarian regime. Obviously, this must have looked very threatening. Just months after the beginning of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, Russia proceeded with the next stage of its invasion, annexed the Crimea, and also invaded the southeastern parts of Ukraine. And these images from the war zone in 2014 in the southeast of Ukraine are very similar to what we're seeing today in the Russian aggression against the northeast of Ukraine. So it's just step by step, and it grows and grows. So between 2014 and 2022, this was the war zone. The occupied territories were very small at that time. And in the rest of Ukraine, very important things were happening. In the rest of Ukraine, we saw amazing reforms that have been happening in the past several years specifically. Ukraine has been changing a lot, and there was always here that Ukraine is a very poor, very corrupt country. That is true, but this is also not entirely true in the sense that there is a whole dynamic here. Ukraine experienced amazing economic growth, the growth in democratic institutions. And again, from the Russian side, it certainly looked as something very threatening because nothing like it was happening in Russia at the time. And we now see the invasion of 2022 from a much larger territory. And the question that I want to leave us before I finish speaking is that this is the progression, right? A tiny little invasion in 2003, a larger in 2014, then a much larger in 2022. What is next? What is the next step in this never-ending aggression of Russia against Ukraine? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Besanova, for the succinct, yet at the same time, very thorough explanation about events in Ukraine and putting them in a broader context. Because that context is so critical for us as a public to make sense of what's going on. And you very succinctly summarized it with there's a progression and that there's a pattern here of do an initial invasion, see how the world reacts, pull back, and then come back for more. And you've clearly demonstrated that that has happened time and time and time again. And you rightly leave us with the question of what's the next step and what comes next. And that's a question that we will explore a bit later on in our panel discussion. So I do have a second question to direct to a couple of our panelists, both Dr. Sorin Nastasia and former Congressman John Shimkus. And that is, what are the implications for countries that surround Ukraine and for the broader European Union? What countries are especially concerned about what's happening and why? And I will go ahead and start off with Dr. Nastasia and then turn things over to former Congressman Shimkus to weigh in on this.
Thank you very much. Well, I come from the country of Romania, and I know from the study of our history that things that are happening in Ukraine have been happening in that part of Europe for a long time, for maybe the past 2000 years. Whenever there was a bigger empire around these nations that were not formed enough to, or didn't have a chance to form in time because of the influence of the empires around them, we always had to fight these kind of local wars and extended wars and so on and so forth. Luckily for Romania, we were able to form the country from the principalities that existed before, at the end of the 19th century with the War of Independence against the Turks. But let me give some context from my slides here. More context for what's happening now in Ukraine. So for those of you participating in this panel as attendees, and maybe you have never been interested in where is the location of such countries in Eastern Europe, in especially Ukraine, this is the map of Ukraine nowadays, and you can see marked here that the recent changes, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, not even yet indicated here the changes of Luhansk and Donetsk war regions or separatist regions. But you can see where you have the bigger cities, the organization of the country split into different regions. I think they are called oblasts, right, in Ukraine. Here you can see the area of separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk, and the concentration of population. For example, Kyiv, you can see that it has a population roughly like St. Louis Metro, right, around 3 million people. After what happened in the past month and 5 weeks in Ukraine, we have seen this kind of transfer of population, migration from Ukraine in Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia, Belarus, and Russia. There are some discussions that some of the people that went to Russia were deported by force from some of the regions, especially around Mariupol and so on and so forth. But you can see that the huge transfer of population that was done, especially towards Poland, more than 2,300,000 people, and this is updated to March 29th, only 2 days ago. And look how much, I know for sure for the population of Romania, this is a big impact on the local economy because, Romania is a country of roughly 20 million people, and to bring all of a sudden 600,000 more people, there's a lot of strain in the economy, especially with, the disruption in transfer of energy, and we will see it in the summer or at the end of the summer. Ukraine and Romania are big producers of cereals or of wheat and the sunflower seeds and so on and so forth that are very important for local economies. And this will have ripple effects very soon in the rest of Europe. You can see here something that is also very important and relevant, the NATO's deterrence and defense facilities across Europe. You can see the black dots. It's amazing that nowadays in Poland and Romania, there are 4 ballistic missile defense systems, or at least US bases, military bases in those countries, more than in Germany. There's 3 in Germany and there's 4 in Poland and Romania. So it's been thought about with the accession to NATO of those countries, and with the willingness of those countries to become part of the European Union. As you can see, our colleague Beshanova was talking about modernization of Ukraine in the past 10, 15 years. And you could see in the speeches of the President Zelensky, this willingness of the whole society in Ukraine to modernize, to get closer to the NATO structures, to the European Union economic welfare system or economic collaboration system. So much more than anything, it seems to me that the war that is happening now, it's not just a war of aggression from Russia to Ukraine, but it's a war of civilizations, because Russia is going back to the understanding of revisionism, of trying to get back territories that were never necessarily theirs, but they were taken, by crimes of opportunity for dealings that they had at the end of the Second World War. The economic impact is presented here in brief from a blog that I found recently. It's about the impact on crude oil, natural gas for European and US natural gas. You can see those graphics going very much up like never before. Of course, they were on the upward trend because of COVID, but this war has provoked even more cataclysms from the economic point of view. And it's only going to be more impactful. So what is the societal impact that I could understand up to now? Europe will likely be more unified. An attack the margins of Europe has reminded the countries of the European Union that we're kind of discussing in the past 10 years. We had the Brexit. There were other countries that were thinking about, maybe European Union is not the best solution for us. Some of the Eastern European countries, especially Hungary, but, partially Poland, were going with their governments a little bit towards, more centralized and dictatorial kinds of leadership. So also the impact of what's going on is that Europe will likely become more militarized. We have seen the very much increased budget of Germany towards arming themselves, rethinking societal roles of the mega rich, and by oligarchs, we can understand not only the Russian oligarchs, but also people who around the world who concentrate a lot of wealth of the world in their own hands, which is not necessarily helpful for the economy of the world and democracy. Addressing propaganda and disinformation practices. Even today, I was seeing an article, it's in a continuation of several articles that were talking about the fact that in Ukraine now, everybody is kind of in the fog of war. Everybody is believing that the other person is a spy, and they're, putting a lot of checkpoints and trying to see if there are collaborators with the Russians or infiltrators or people who want to provoke more hardship in Ukraine. And it's very hard to pass such control points. What is the political impact? It is a watershed moment for European politics. It's a reminder of why past generations created democratic institutions. It's provoking, again, strengthening of the European Union. It's a challenge to far-right populist leaders and parties across Eastern and Western Europe. And that's why I included a picture of the Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, because he was, very much a point of concern for the European Union. Challenge, and there's also a challenge to illiberalism trend that is going on not only in the European Union, but around the world. So key concerns, and this is my last slide, it's a fear of invasion of additional Eastern European nations if Russia will continue this. And even if we see right now some withdrawal of the troops, and I just saw before coming into this panel news about the fact that the Russian army left Chernobyl, that doesn't mean that Russia is done with this. If Putin is gonna reinforce his role in his own country, that means that he's just waiting for another opportunity to attack again. And you see, he insists that yeah, we will withdraw our troops if Ukraine will never think about becoming part of NATO, because that's a direct threat to us. But that's just an invitation for later on, when he will have enough forces again to attack again. And we are just at the border with Ukraine. We have two kind of borders with Ukraine in the north. I mean Romania, and in the east by the sea coast, by the Black Sea coast, around the Republic of Moldova. So for us, there's lots of things that we should worry about with such a vicinity with the Russian forces that can come over there in just a matter of hours. What are other key concerns? Human rights of Ukrainian refugees. You have seen on TV all the time, all day long, where people are accommodated in different countries. You can hear, happy stories of somebody in Great Britain gave his own house, or a second house that he had, to a family of 10 Ukrainians. Somebody yesterday in the United States was giving his house to a family of Ukrainians. But these are the very, very happy stories. Most of them are accommodated in cots, in big stadiums or covered structures, to be sifted through, to be checked. And then people will think what they can do if they can have a refugee status for the 3 years, as it was recognized by the European Union. And then what will they do? Because some of them don't know English, don't know the local language. And then they will have to see if they have the skills to work in different jobs that might exist. And don't forget, a majority of these migrants are women with children, or old people, because the men 16 to 60 were kept in the country to fight against the Russians. Another key concern, worries regarding nuclear power plants and possible use of nuclear weapons. So that is, the thing that stops everybody else from really getting involved military in Ukraine. This kind of threat from Putin, hey, I'm gonna use those weapons that I have. That are very powerful and that will provoke World War III. Some of the people say that already World War III started, so we have to pay attention to these things. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Dr. Nastasia, for your broad and comprehensive look at what's happening, as well as a lot of the implications that come from it. And a couple of the big ideas that come from what it is you've talked about is that Moscow is going back to getting territory that was never theirs to begin with. And that's a really big theme that underlies the conversation here. And also, you pointed out a number of things that come from this, such as a more unified Europe, a more militarized Europe, rethinking of societal roles of the mega rich, addressing propaganda and disinformation, fear of invasion of additional Eastern European nations, and also worries about nuclear power plants and the possible use of nuclear weapons. And so I turn the same question that we began this part of the conversation to former Congressman Shimkus, and that is, what are the implications for countries surrounding Ukraine and the broader European Union? What countries are especially concerned about what's happening and why?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Moffat. First of all, I want to follow up that to Putin, those lands are his. They go back to his view on Tsarist Russia and the USSR. So, from his mentality, if you look at his speech in Munich in 2007, his statement was the greatest catastrophe of the world was the fall of the Soviet Union. So from his perspective, even though these are independent countries, he views that they are part of the old Russian structure, whether you go back to the Tsarist time or you go back to the Soviet Union. I want to make sure. And Dr. Vesnahova, she is correct. What people in the West don't understand is Russia has always meddled with their neighbors going back to 1991. Look at cyber attacks in Estonia, look at meddling in elections, look at funding political campaigns, really even of parties like the Green Party to push Western Europe off of fossil fuels so that they can then become reliant on fossil fuels from Russia. So that's, I mean, for those of us who kind of lived, eat, and breathe this part of the world, this has been the life of the neighbors since 1991. The Dr. Nastasia talked, and when we're talking about what about the neighbors, if the war was going as the Russians had planned, my feeling is that they would have tried not only to get a land bridge from Donetsk to Crimea, but they would then move to Moldova and destabilize that. Moldova has a frozen conflict in an area called Transnistria with Russian troops there. And so that's continued a movement west, which would also continue to destabilize Europe. And Moldova is the poorest of all the countries, also has taken a large migrant population, and they're doing their best to help manage those. Most people know my expertise is more in the Baltic area, where established the Baltic Caucasus. So you have obviously 3 small countries on the Baltic Sea: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They also have, during the Soviet era, the Russification, in essence, the movement of Russians to displace ethnic Estonians or ethnic Latvians to, again, Russify the country. The fear there is then another push by Russia to claim protection of ethnic Russian minorities as a cause for invasion. And this has been a concern for decades now. However, I think stories now coming out of, because you do have a free media, free press in those countries telling the contrary story than what you're seeing from RT. And so you even have ethnic Russian Latvians who now are able to see the ravage of war put on by Putin against innocent Ukrainians. So I think in all this account, in the big picture of Putin, he's losing, right? The problem is there is a still hot conflict in Ukraine, and I would just say never trust a Russian who's saying they're pulling back. Right before the war, the rumors were they were pulling back across, back off the country borders. But fortunately, and President Biden was right in being able to speak truth to power based upon intel to say they're coming, they're coming, they're coming. Obviously, there was some skeptics in the West, but the intel was good, and getting real world intel as soon as possible, I think has been very, very helpful in this conflict. The question is, how do we continue to help Ukraine without deploying obviously NATO forces, which right for now is a no-go by the NATO allies.
Yeah, thank you so much, former Congressman Shimkus, for sharing about Vladimir Putin and Russia always meddling with neighbors, going all the way back to 1991, and the long history of doing so in varying ways that hasn't gotten much, if any, media attention here in the United States. And so I want to move now to our third question. And so our third question is directed toward Dr. Rewrightney. Because this conflict, can you tell us a bit about some of the broader ramifications of this conflict for international politics and relations? And I ask this question because this conflict involves multiple nation states, both near and spatially far from the conflict, but at the same time, those countries are involved in varying ways.
Yeah, I can, and thank you, Dr. Moffat, for that question. First, let me just say, if I'm a little unclear at times, I apologize. I do have a health issue, which kind of makes it hard for me to talk at times. So the implications, I think, are several, and they can be economic and political. The economic implications, Dr. Nastasia already talked about it a little bit in his presentation, but I do want to go into a bit more detail on the effect of sanctions. So once the invasion happened, Russia has been subjected to the most punishing sanctions regime the world has ever seen. It has already had a serious impact on Russia. The ruble has gone down about 20%. The stock market only recently opened after being closed for about a month. But now I don't want to talk about the impact of sanctions on Russia. I want to talk about the impact of sanctions on the outside world. And here, I think there are two things that come to mind. One is the effect on the energy sector, and two, more general supply chain issues. Russia, as we know, is a major exporter of oil. They account for about 10% of the global oil production and about 18% of the global natural gas production. So, and if you talk about Europe, Europe's dependence on Russian oil is a lot higher. When the sanctions kicked in, a lot of countries completely banned using Russian imports. The United States has a complete ban. The UK has said that by the end of this year, they are going to wean themselves off. Europe has a ban, but they are cutting down, and they have this long-term plan where they would no longer rely on Russian oil by 2030. But what has happened is Russia, on average, produces about 10 million barrels of oil per day before the invasion. Out of that 10 million, about 3 million is now taken off the market because that's approximately the amount of oil that the countries that have banned Russian oil used to use. So like you're talking about a 30% reduction of Russian oil from the market. Now it's just simple demand and supply economics. Now the demand is going up for oil. We are just emerging out of a pandemic. The supply is less. So as a result, oil prices have gone up. I think right now it's about $108 per barrel of oil. It went up to about 130 maybe 10 days back. And in early December, it was 71, 72, around that range. So oil prices have gone up. What are the implications of this? It has slowed down the post-COVID recovery in Europe. It has complicated efforts in the US to deal with inflation, and especially oil importing countries. A lot of the developing countries which don't have oil, so suddenly they're finding, they have to pay like a lot more to get their oil, and that has had an impact on them. The second thing that I think we need to think about is if a certain percentage of Russian oil is no longer accessible, what do we do now? So then somebody else has to step in and ramp up their production. So there have been calls in the US to ramp up production. It's a bit of a contentious issue here. And then even if we were to ramp up, it's not like, turning on a switch that you can suddenly produce more oil immediately. It's going to take a few months. So the really interesting thing for me is how it has, and I use the term intentionally, how it has created an opportunity for like pariah countries. Two countries that I have in mind are Iran and Venezuela. So we know Iran is a major exporter of oil, and there have been heavy sanctions. Until Russia, Iran used to be the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. So Iranian oil, Iran is unable to export that. So after, we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, the sanctions came back on. And now I think there is an incentive to try and, try and re-sign the nuclear deal so that, Iranian oil in the market suddenly becomes kind of attractive. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. There's like a lot of moving parts and a lot of opposition. The same thing with Venezuela. So the administration has made some overtures to the Venezuelan government, but I think with Venezuela, it's a little harder because the oil facilities are far more dilapidated and it'll take like a long time before they are up and running. The second economic implication, and again, this is something that Dr. Nastasia touched upon, is the effect on food security. Russia and Ukraine are major corn exporters, major wheat exporters. Ukraine is the largest exporter of sunflower oil and seeds. And a lot of their corn and wheat go into developing countries, like in North Africa, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, and so on. And then those grain prices are going to go up. And the other issue is with fertilizer. So a lot of developing countries buy fertilizer. So a key ingredient, two key ingredients in fertilizer is ammonia and potash. Potash is a potassium-based salt. So Russia is a key exporter of both of those. So the chances are that the money, the price of ammonia and potash will go up. Let me take a couple of minutes and talk about political ramifications. Again, this is something that Dr. Nastasia touched upon. With Europe, there has been no doubt this crisis has pulled Europe together. And I think Vladimir Putin has done something that no American president has been able to do, which is to bring Europe together. Now, the interesting thing is how other countries in the world, other major countries in the world have reacted to the Russian invasion. I think some of the major countries are hedging their bets. They are kind of sitting on the fence. And the countries that I can think of are China, obviously, India, Brazil, Israel, South Africa. So, like the US has been trying to get China to be like more decisive, to condemn Putin more directly, but they have refused to do that. Right now, it seems to me that they are playing both sides. They have never condemned Ukraine that I'm aware of, but at the same time, they have also said that they respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And the reasons why all these countries like, China, India, Israel, they're hedging their bets, I don't think that's like one explanation. It's different reasons for each country. They all have interest with Moscow, and they also have interest with Washington, and they are trying to balance that. So the upshot of that is perhaps some of the major countries like China, like India, like Brazil, are doing as enough as they can to try and bring this horrible conflict to an end. And with that, I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rewrightney, for your expansive answer, and you did a fantastic job of explaining a lot of the downline effects, especially with respect to oil production, and also food and fertilizer production and prices, but also at the same time, why some countries are playing both sides of the fence with respect to this conflict, especially China. And so to take a question that Dr. Besanova posed much earlier, and to go ahead and move it forward here, something was asked right at the very back end of that presentation. And that is, how do you see the events unfolding in the days and weeks ahead? And I'd like to begin that conversation with Dr. Rewrightney, and then thereafter, expand that conversation out to our other panelists as well, as they would like to weigh in on this.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Moffat, and I'll try to be quick here. I'm a little leery of making predictions. A lot of the things that I've already said about Russia have not turned out that way. So I think there are multiple ways that this could pan out over the next few weeks. I think it's clear that Putin hasn't had the decisive victory that he thought he would. He thought he could just go into Kyiv in like a few days and take over the whole country. That clearly hasn't happened. So I think there is some evidence that he's recalibrating. And then the question becomes, what does a recalibration look like? So I think rather than trying to take over the whole country, he might be more focused on like the eastern part, the Donbass region, and then put the east and the south, so that he can connect Crimea with, so he can have like a more secure land connection with Crimea. And this is why the city of Mariupol becomes so important, because Mariupol lies between Crimea and the Donbass region. So I think one thing that might happen is that Putin recalibrates it, focuses it on the eastern part of Ukraine with the aim of perhaps trying to bifurcate, like to partition Ukraine into the east and the west. So sort of like, East Germany, West Germany, North Korea, South Korea kind of dynamic. I mean, I do have I think there are other possibilities too. One, I think Putin has clearly shown that he doesn't care about civilian life. So even though that the military invasion hasn't gone according to plan, he might dig in, because of their sheer numerical superiority, there's a chance that if it is like a war of attrition, that Putin might prevail in the end. So if that is the case, they could still try to, take over Kyiv. And then what happens if they take over Kyiv? My guess is that they're going to install a Putin, like a puppet regime that they can control. So let me just say one more thing, and then I'll wrap up on that. Either scenario, whether it's just Eastern Ukraine, whether the conflict is centered on Eastern Ukraine, or whether he tries to take over the whole country, I think we are definitely going to see an insurgency from within, because Ukrainians are going to keep on resisting. And then some Western countries have actually openly said that they would support a clandestine movement against Russia. Yeah, and with that,
I want to add something, if possible, for the larger perspective of what we should look forward to. And I want to share the screen with some of the slides that I didn't have time to show before. Starting from 2014, it became very, very popular in Russia to make statements that are increasingly aggressively anti-American and anti-West in general. This is from 2014, America should die. One of the many, many popular manifestations in Russia with this kind of rhetoric. As you can see, President Obama was president of the United States at that time. And it says on this rocket, personally for Obama, so threatening, obviously, the United States. Here, Europe and America kills Russians at the Donbass, so blaming directly the United States for some completely imaginary murders of Russians in the Donbass region. Since then, and I'm seeing from the beginning of this invasion on February 24th, daily on Russian television, we hear complete normalization of nuclear strikes against countries of Eastern and Western Europe. So it's discussed gleefully on Russian propaganda TV with maps, with everything. Let's go, let's deliver nuclear strikes. And one of the scariest statements, the chief Russian propagandist says, well, if we have to destroy the whole world, we will. The whole world, boom, boom. Everybody laughs, and that's exciting. That is the really scary scenario of what we should expect from the development of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you to both Drs. Besnova and also Wirartny for your insights on where you see some events unfolding in the days and weeks ahead. So would either of our other panelists like to chime in on this question?
Yes, I was reading recently from different articles, and I saw even important writers from Russia. Most of the people who can talk don't necessarily live anymore in Russia, because otherwise they would be arrested. It's illegal to say anything about the line of politics that is central in Russia. So you can go to prison even for demonstrating. I don't know if you saw that phase when a guy was keeping just an empty paper piece in his hand, and he was asked by the police, hey, what are you doing with that paper in your hand? And he said, nothing, I'm just showing it to you. You know that provoking commotion against the security of the state is punishable with penalty of up to 15 years in prison. And he said, well, then I'm just showing it to you. And they arrested him. He just held an empty paper in his hand. So he was arrested for that. So it's so crazy nowadays in Russia. But this writer, I don't remember his name now, he was saying that kind of the same what Dr. Radne was mentioning earlier, that it could be an implosion. It could be a revolution from the inside in Russia. Especially if little by little people will find out how many soldiers died in Ukraine, how much was lost economically because of this aggression, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to address, and I know that this is delicate and I don't want to attack anybody. I will start with what I understand. What was the reason, the official reason of the Russian army in Putin invading Ukraine? They said that they will denazify Ukraine, right? I read about it, and I am informed about what things are going on in Ukraine and in Romania and in the neighboring countries and in the rest of the world. There are ultra-nationalistic groups in Ukraine. There are ultra-nationalistic groups in Romania, in Hungary, in the United States. Remember those torch demonstrations in South Carolina a few years ago? Those are Nazis around the world. There are people who are having their, ultra-nationalistic ideas towards protecting their own nation, what they consider the main stream of their own nation. And I have seen all kinds of documentaries, all kinds of movies lately. Ultra-nationalists exist in Russia too. You have seen them in the pictures shown by Dr. Beshanova. And it's so easy to just throw out some expressions out there. Former President Donald Trump was saying at the beginning of the invasion that the movement of bringing peace troops in Luhansk and Donetsk by Putin was a genius idea. Well, he backed up a little bit when he saw that even his own party was not on his side. So more than anything, as I mentioned before, to me, this is a war of civilizations. It's clear to me that the people of Ukraine nowadays want to be closer to a democracy, to a way of life that is more similar to European Union, to Western world, to the United States. And we have seen even among the victims in Ukraine, that woman that died together with her children when the Russians bombed a corridor that they accepted for the people to pass from the war zone to the Ukrainian control zone. She was a CEO in the Silicon Valley, and she was living in Ukraine and she was working from over there. So there are many people who try to modernize. There are many people who try to bring their own country towards democracy one way or another. And there are groups in any nation that would like to see revisionism, that would like to see more of their country in its heydays. But the idea is that we should not allow this cancer of war to be spread again in Europe, because that will be disastrous for the rest of the world.
All right, former Congressman Shimkus, I think you're muted.
I got
All
it.
right, there we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry I respond. The panelists have done such a great job. So I'm just going to go back to the question that you had asked. Where do we see the war going? Early in the conflict, I warned people in the media that if you push Putin into a corner, he will strike out. So I think the talk about more catastrophic events based upon that is, I think that's credible. I think most of us who observed this region had thought that if he would have seized Donetsk and Luhansk and a bridge to Crimea, no one would be happy with it, but that's where I think most observers thought he would go instead of trying to take over the whole country. He has to save face now. If he can't take over the whole country, I think that was his goal. So I think that is the attempt to reposition forces and then go back to that immediate military objective, what I think most of us thought. And then he'll partition Ukraine. It'll be a frozen conflict, very much like, I guess, again, Germany and other places that, I mean, Germany was able to reconcile and get, and obviously get unified. So it may take a long, long time, but that's what I fear this will end in, a partitioned Ukraine. I mean, and look, Zelensky can't negotiate giving away Ukrainian territory. He just can't. Otherwise, he will not be president. They've got a competitive political. He's now, you know, the most favored elected official in Ukraine because of his obviously his leadership, his bravery. But I can't see him, and maybe Olga can answer. I don't see him being able to go to a negotiating table and say, yeah, we're going to give up Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. I just don't see that happening.
Yes, handing over, even if somebody had the will to do that, handing over any part of Ukraine, officially the Crimea or the Donbas area, to Russia, it's not going to change anything. Russia is going to withdraw, regroup, and deliver another strike in a few years, then hoping for more territory. This is an unending process. This is not about specifically these territories. This is about the state of war and maintaining it constantly, because it improves ratings at home, because the support for the war in Russia is enormous, enthusiastic, and that support is what drives the war effort more than the whims of one individual, which is Putin. It was the same before him, it's the same with him, it's going to be the same after him.
All right, thank you everyone for your wide-ranging discussion about how you see events unfolding in the days and in the weeks ahead. And I want to shift gears toward one audience question that came up and was posted in the Q&A. And that is this. And I'd like to, and I open this up to the panelists, and we'll have this as the last question before we go ahead and wrap things up for the day, because the hour has gone by very, very quickly. And that is, if Ukraine can't yet perhaps join NATO, and Russia will never stop incrementally trying to take it all, what stops Russia? Because from Putin's point of view, there's no benefit ever in stopping. So what can be done? And so not only asking the question here, but at the same time, also on behalf of other at-risk nations too.
Well, my biggest hope right now is that the sanctions are going to be effective, and that they're going to break the backbone of the Russian economy to the point where continued invasion and re-invasion 2, 3, 5 years from now is going to be impossible. That is where I'm seeing the hope.
Yes,
I think.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just think that the obviously the Ukrainians continue to need to. They've surprised and excited the whole world with their valor and their commitment and their sacrifice, and the West has to continue to pour in weapons and obviously support for life and food and health and medical, and we just need to be all in for the Ukrainians. I mean, all in as much as we can, and that's how you if we're not going to send troops, that's how we have to be there to help them.
Yeah, I think this is similar to what happened to the Soviet Empire during the aggression in Afghanistan. It was again an economic, the economic element brought the Soviet Union down. And it was again after the United States realized that they can earmark a lot of money for armament that was modern and was sent to the Afghanis. And the Afghanis were able to take down with those shoulder-kept weapons helicopters that before the time were just machine gunning everybody as they saw in the morning while they were discussing what did you do with your wife yesterday. What did you discuss with your wife yesterday over the phone? So, this is what is going to happen, in my opinion, with Ukraine and Russia. Russia will lose economically, and because they are not organized in the modern style of democracies, because everybody is still waiting after the reinvention of the Tsarist empire, then we had the Soviet empire, then we had this kind of empire that is continuing the same policies that are 1,000 years old of Russia. Expanding at the margins of their empire. They are the only empire of the world that was expanding by geographical expansion, not by seafaring and having colonies somewhere on a different continent. Yes. So with the only exception of when they sold part of their territory to the United States, Alaska, they always wanted to first push some population into another nation, then claim that that is Russian territory, then Russify it even more. I have seen it in the former territory of Romania in Bessarabia, the Republic of Moldova of nowadays. I had colleagues in the 90s when I was a student in Bucharest, and they were telling me about the war that they had with Russia for Transnistria. It was a gruesome war, and only by understanding that there's nothing but the colors of your flag, of simple people, not very educated people. The simple people will do the wars. The simple people will feel the pride of a nation. So that is why I'm saying that this is a war of civilizations, because Ukraine will continue to be tied more and more with the West. I am sure that they will accept economic aid, military aid, either on the surface or underground, to rebuild their country, to reorganize their country on democratic principles. The only problem is that Russia will keep on threatening that if they associate with formal structures, European Union and NATO, they will attack even more. So Ukrainians are in it for the long haul. The problem is that the eastern part of the Russians were trying in the eastern part of Ukraine to depopulate and totally destroy certain cities, especially Mariupol. I understand that something like 90% of the buildings are erased in Mariupol. Remember that the Russians have allowed the Germans to do that in Warsaw during the Second World War, so they can come on an empty territory to be the liberators. So they will be doing this over and over again if they are not pushed back one way or another. And I think that the tool that worked before, with the example with Afghanistan, is to cripple them economically so they can implode from the inside.
All right, so alas, the hour has passed, and the hour has passed rather quickly. And there's much more to discuss from here, but a few closing comments from my end of it. First off, thank you to our panelists for lending their expertise and the time to help us better understand the events in Ukraine and why they matter. And thank you to our audience to giving the last hour to us to unpack these things and to talk over these things. I'm grateful for our panelists, both professionally and personally, for all your work on this. And I'm thankful you chose to participate on today's panel. And also, I'd be irresponsible if I didn't say this. We can't forget the Ukrainian people in the conversation, because the Ukrainian people have fought valiantly. They've suffered immensely. And in the chat, I'm putting in a link to an NPR article to places where you can go and you can help. In addition, Dr. Besnova, in answering a question of what else can the US do, write your senators, write your members of Congress. So those are a couple of different action steps, if you will, that we can take from this conversation. And also, in terms of thank yous, I'd like to thank Dr. Wiratney for suggesting that we have this panel, because this panel wouldn't have happened in part without his suggestion to do it. I'd also like to thank Dr. Nastasia, the Department of Political Science, College of Arts and Sciences, and Marketing and Communications for helping promote this event, because this event wouldn't have gone as well as it had had these things not occurred. And with that, I say farewell, stay safe, and I hope that each one of you has a great remainder of your week. Thank you so much. Have a great day.